Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen.
Welcome, everybody. I'm with Steve Keen, post-Keynesian economist. I'm back again in virtual studio. Of course, it's the only way we could do things because Professor Keen is on the other side of the planet. And that is the benefit of our technology these days. Steve, how are you doing this week?
Apologising for being late, as I told you off camera. I made the mistake of watching Federer almost lose his way out of Wimbledon first round last night, and haven't really got my head together since then, so I'm a bit on the vague side, but I'll try to catch up now. So good, but too much to do, including watching my one favourite sport, which is tennis.
Yes. Well, there's a thing that's going to have to happen, and I'm going to do a little bit of coaching here for you, Steve, because I keep reminding you how important you are to society. Okay, so here's the thing: is that the party starts when Steve gets there. You're never late, man.
Well, nonetheless, I heard the story about Princess Margaret, who, of course, was a woman who should have been queen, just made the mistake of being born after her sister rather than before, and she would apparently go to dinner parties, great socializer, and she would turn up hours late and nobody would eat before she got there. And when she got there, she'd pontificate for another 3 hours and people would be falling asleep with with starvation effects and everything else. And nobody could leave because she was the Queen's sister. So I'll try not to be quite that bad a prima donna.
Yeah, no kidding. So, Steve, I wanted to start today's episode off with a sentiment analysis. And I know that this is kind of creeping into economics. Okay, is the sentiment of populations, right?
Yeah.
And so what I did is I took this. I'm gonna share my screen here with you.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, so what we're going to be looking at here is a sentiment analysis of some Google News for COVID and climate. Now, that's the name and the theme of the show here. This sentiment analysis monitors news, and it does this rainbow of color ranging from anger, anticipation, disgust, fear, joy, sadness, surprise, and trust. I'm kind of skeptical about all these delineations of it's such an upset, like it's such a subjective. Seems to me like the experiment would be such a subjective checkbox type of thing. So I'm kind of skeptical about it, anyways, right? But there seems to be a pretty straight sort of hierarchy here of trust at the higher end of COVID and of climate, which is kind of a good thing, I suppose. What are we missing here when it comes to this just basically reiterates the problem that we're having, okay, in communicating complex information. You've got the mathematical proofs, man. We know climate change is real. I mean, it's well beyond the real conversation. And, we kind of royally messed up COVID. So what's with the human species here?
I think what I was actually intrigued by that pattern was how little change there was over time. There was trust was at the bottom and fear was at the top. Trust was at the top, and I think fear was at the bottom, and that didn't change all the way through. So you've got to what you get is a tendency for herding in humans, and it isn't just like the herd goes in one direction. There are components of the herd that always go in the same direction. So you've always got your people who are fearful and critical of the authorities. The majority are trusting, and that means what you've got is herd sentiment. You don't have individuals all making their own utility maximizing independent decisions with sort of nonsense the neoclassicals have, people communicate with each other and you get a broad spectrum of opinion where most people end up trusting the system as it stands. Now, if the system itself isn't making major changes, then neither do the individuals in it. So again, it comes back to the approach that I take. The neoclassicals, because their theory, they couldn't prove the stability of all the mathematical procedures they thought ruled the marketplace. They couldn't prove that supply and demand would coordinate with a multi-market system. They couldn't prove that consumers, would behave the same way collectively as an individual consumer, so on and so forth. So what they did to compensate with that failure was to create this totally aggrandized vision of humans as people who can actually understand completely the system they're in, so much so that they can anticipate where it's going to go in the future. That's what's called rational expectations. Now, that's garbage, of course.
Yeah.
But that garbage has become how the mainstream thinks that people think, because it's the only way the mainstream can make their models function, which just shows how bad the models are. But for the rest of us, what it shows is that we tend to trust the current system, and it's the structure of the current system and the controls of the current system that dominate rather than individual behavior.
Okay, I have a little inquiry here that has a lot to do with the, I guess maybe a Marxist defense of the capitalist structure. And this is just in response to what you just explained. This to me sounds, and you're describing something that seems, the herd mentality seems to be just a function of the population. So one of the issues that I come across when I'm listening to somebody explain a Marxist theory about the power structures and the differences in class, and this invariably distills down into something like they're forcing us to stay in this class kind of thing. And I don't know if it's so much of the forcing that's happening. I think it's more what you're describing as a natural phenomenon that we cluster in this herd mentality in population.
Well, yeah, we basically adapt to the system we're born into. The system itself can change and evolve over time, and of course there can be huge political shifts, like the shift from feudalism to capitalism. The accidental, it really was an accident, the communists won in 1917 in Russia. A couple of incidents gone the opposite way, there you would still have had the Tsar there. But what then happens is that it's the people who determine the overall power structure. They're, of course, at the top of it, they benefit from it. So they're going to be pushing it as much as they can, and they push an ideology as well. And the vast majority of people go along with that ideology, whether that's what's happening in North Korea or what happens in America. But what that your little thing showed to me is, as well, as there's a dispersal. Not even, we're not clones of each other. So you do get people at one extreme who are will just go along with the system as it stands and not really think about it. They live their day-to-day lives. And then the other end, you got people who are joining either Marxists or libertarian groups trying to overthrow the system with a different direction, pushing as much as they can. But in most of the time, in most circumstances of history, they're trivial against the inertia and momentum of the system itself.
And you're finding you're up against that inertia as well. I mean, but the difference is that you're saying, hey, wait a minute, I have something here I've got a mathematical proof. It seems to work in the past. Why can't we look at it?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking more about the battle of ideology over economics. And the frustrating thing for me is that we reproduce ideologies just like we reproduce our children. And the persistence of the neoclassical ideology is enormous. And I think there's good questions as to why is it so hard to shake, and why do people become totally besotted with it. And it does come down to, I think, again, part of humanity. We are a belief-sharing species. We don't weave webs. We don't we don't go skydiving for fish. What we do is we share beliefs and we create structures based on those beliefs. And that so the beliefs are an essential part of who we are. But it always seems we're trying to be, we're trying to explain and give a rationale that makes sense why things are the way they are because they should be. Seems to be part of, but also things can be better. That's part, those two elements of humanity. And neoclassical economics comes out with a vision saying we've almost got it right. We've got a capitalist system, which is the best system you can possibly have, but it's got a few imperfections we should try to remove. And we're going to remove those imperfections and make the place absolutely perfect. And they become religious zealots. And when somebody falls for this stuff, and I saw a guy yesterday on Twitter. I just read it and I thought, do I want to make a serious reply to this child, or do I just refer him to my new cartoon and annoy him that way? So I referred him to my new cartoon instead, because once somebody swallowed the blue pill, what's the blue pill, red pill?
Yeah,
it's more actually. I'd go back to Jonestown. It's more once they've swallowed the Kool-Aid. They don't die, but they remain in a state of suspended mental acuity, and everything has to be reframed in terms of the neoclassical virus. So because it's such a it taps into this, I think, primal need to talk about a perfect system. That makes it incredibly hard to shake, even though it's fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I can understand that, and then look in terms of belief, what people are up against. We've got religious structures where, I mean, I'm a philosopher. I talked to lots of philosophers today. I had a really eye-opening conversation with another guest on our show.
Yeah,
and it was. I mean, he comes from a Judeo-Christian background. Actually, he's an Orthodox Jew, and I mean that everything informs his life. I'm okay with that, but there's part of our discussion that is, I'd rather have the religions we know about. I don't want to be creating another religion in this, in the neoclassical tradition, and there's something that seems very immaterial and I guess mythological about our economic system. I would also point to Yuval Noah Harari that he calls it like the myth of it's a myth. This is something that it's how we're agreeing to live together.
Yeah, I mean, but if this is the thing, you say it's a myth, and that's true, because if you got an alien species landing on the planet and trying to analyze our social system by observation, the last thing they talk about is it being an equilibrium.
Yeah.
Right? But that's become the religion of the neoclassicals. That's why I was laughing about this guy that I saw a set of tweets from yesterday talking about dynamic equilibrium models. There's no such bloody thing. It's just they're neoclassical being forced into this bizarre contraption because the long run equilibrium of the Ramsey growth model on which the DSGE models are based is unstable. So they had to get around it by saying we can work out the dynamics of the system. There's a single path that leads to the stable. If you imagine a horse, which is pointing at some random direction in a field while wearing a saddle, we are supposed to be able to instantly work out which way the horse is pointing and then jump onto a cable so that we land on the cable and run down perfectly along the spine of the horse on the saddle and slowly fluctuate to be on the. That's how we reach equilibrium, because we can all work out, which way the horse is facing. It's nonsense, but they fall into it. And but in the real world, you describe it. Capitalism's strengths, as well as its weaknesses, are its non-equilibrium behaviours. And so we've got a totally mythical view of how the economy operates, dominating how people try to manage the economy. And it's no damn wonder we end up with a catastrophe after catastrophe, which has only got worse after the neoclassicals took over in the mid-1970s.
Yeah. Okay. So the interesting thing, I think the heuristic that the audience wants to kind of draw upon for the failure of equilibrium, would that be the crash of 2008?
It's virtually everything. Okay. But yeah, the crash of 2008 is a classic example of that, because The neoclassicals, a theory gives you a set of goggles, but it also gives you a set of blinkers. So a theory, this is have you read Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions?
Yep.
Okay. If anybody hasn't read that, bugger off and go read it. Okay. So it's one of the brilliant pieces of intellectual reasoning, in my opinion. And what he pointed out is the theory selects the facts that it tests itself by. So if you have a theory, there's no such thing as an observation-free theory. Yes, we do observe, and that's a critical side of where we start from. But the type of division that Popper I try to argue between theory and observation isn't there. It's a meld. And Kuhn's point was that once you have a theory of something, that indicates the facts you should research, and it also indicates the facts you should ignore. So neoclassical economics, in terms of when you look at the facts that it directs your attention to, it's the rate of interest, the rate of inflation, the rate of unemployment, and the level of the government deficit. Those are the fund. It's actually not so much the government deficit in terms of the DSG models. It's fundamentally inflation, unemployment, the behavioural parameters they talk about. But in terms of the statistical stuff, they'd be testing their theory against will be the rate of interest, the rate of unemployment, the rate of inflation. Now, when you look at all those, and you look at the period from 1992-3 through to 2007, all you see is you're approaching nirvana. Okay, interest rates are falling. You're coming down. The inflation rate is falling very steeply. You've gone from 17% to about 2%, and 2% was the target they chose, what they call the Taylor rule. And you saw the unemployment rate falling, and you saw the fluctuations, the cycles falling. Now, looking at those facts, and they are facts, you think, great, we're approaching equilibrium. Fantastic. It's going to be smooth sailing from here on out. Now, my theory, which was based on Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, and talks about the importance of private debt, their theory leaves that out completely. So they collect the data because that's what the statisticians set up in the 1940s did with the flow of funds, but they ignore it because debt doesn't matter in their model. Well, it's vital in mine. So I looked at it, and when I simulated my model, what I got was a period of diminishing cycles and unemployment and inflation, falling interest rates as well, the whole lot, everything we saw factually. And that was a prelude to a crisis, because the crisis would start with diminishing cycles and then rising cycles. So now, as it happens, the real test for a theory should be, well, which one fits the facts better? Well, mine massively better than theirs. But this is where the ideology comes in again. And this is partly what Kuhn talked about in terms of paradigms. If you have a paradigm which encounters an anomaly, your first reaction is to find ways to modify the paradigm to fit the anomaly. You're not going to throw the paradigm out. So taking on my views would throw the paradigm out. All of a sudden, you'd go from money being unimportant to money mattering. You'd have to worry about the level of private debt, which otherwise was irrelevant, et cetera, et cetera. So they just try to modify the paradigm to make it fit the data after the event. And because they could do it, because they've got so many loose parameters, they can fit virtually anything that's after the event. They can't fit before the event. They've gone back to the same old belief system.
Well, I see this as a big problem then under your, don't you? I hear just in the small samplings of the news that are related to private debt, I'm gathering that we're surpassing new levels of private debt all over the world. So
yeah, it's not as important. The private debt itself isn't as important because the rate of growth of private debt is lower this time around than it was before the crisis, and a lot of that private debt's COVID related as well. When I look at the data, I drill down into it, and it's basically corporations have been forced to access lines of credit, small companies taking out overdrafts and so on to cover their cash flow. It hasn't been borrowing for spending, and it certainly hasn't been the housing sector. But now that's turning up. Now what we've got after it, that's quite worrying. Virtually every country on the planet is in a housing bubble right now, because I think a lot of the money that's gone in to keep the system going during COVID has ended up going into financial speculation once more. That's a worry.
Yeah, I was speculating. I don't know if I'm understanding the economic rules at play, but the government of Canada was there was rumors that they wanted to raise the interest rates because there was I think there was something to do with some noticeable inflation numbers, and I was confused. At first I was confused by that, and then the housing just seems to be out of control. It just keeps climbing.
Yeah,
and I don't know if the whether it's the Fed or the Canadian government is saying, hey, look, we just don't know how to keep this growth manageable. The housing just keeps going up.
Yeah, that's a global phenomenon, and it's partly because when you throw money as they have at the system, pardon me, and you don't have the usual levels of spending people can do, it appears they dive into speculation once more with that money. The money, as Michael Hudson put, the Fed's money falls on Wall Street rather than Main Street. Well, that's in steroids under COVID. Thank God the money was pumped out by the government sector to keep people's cash flow going. But it appears that a lot of the QE that's going on is just turbocharging asset markets in general, including, I think, Bitcoin. That's falling over a bit. But yeah, people are just in there gambling and speculating. And we've had 40 years of that now. And if you look at the growth of the belief in speculation as a good thing, it began in the 70s under, again, neoclassical economists, Markowitz and Sharp and Fama and French and Cohen. Effectively the greed is good mentality in economic textbooks. And that's conditioned people's behavior over time. So I see people, when they get money, the first thought is, how can I speculate with this rather than how can I invest with this?
Yeah, they conflate the two concepts of speculation with I guess like foundational principles of investing, and that's problematic, right? Yep.
I mean, there's actually a very good one of my favorite books, which has just become available again in the last couple of years, called Dynamic Economic Systems by a mathematician called John Blatt. And Blatt's a brilliant thinker as well as a brilliant mathematician. Couldn't believe how bad neoclassical economics was when he got accidentally exposed to it. Taught himself the entire discipline in a couple of years of very intense reading, and then wrote his own explanation plus critique in the mainstream. But he got to the point about theory saying that speculation is a good thing, fundamentally, the finance market side of stuff. And he said that the theory there's what's called expected utility theory. And this pretty much argues that if you have two potential outcomes, you can have a linear weighting between the two in terms of what your preferences are. You can't have a non-linear one, because if you become non-linear, according to theory, you become a potential money pump. So people can influence you to go to there and then get back to here again and there again. And each time they do, they're taking fees out of you. So that doesn't work. And he said that applies to what he called placement. So when you buy shares in Amazon, you can be persuaded to buy shares in Tesla the next day and then sell them to buy Amazon shares a day later. And each time you do it, you're handing over fees to the broker. So that's the money pump side of things, he said. But once you've invested in a nuclear power plant, you can't decide to turn it into a sheep farm the next day. So in placement is different to investment. But everything we do in terms of our reasoning thinks in terms of placement. And again, back to one of Keynes's great statements, when the direction of the economy is set by the actions of a casino, the job is likely to be ill done. Well, we've been living in a casino for the last 40 years.
Yeah. And so in that case, in that analogy, in this concept that the house always win, who was the winner in that?
The house, as you say, the finance sector. I mean, the finance sector is far larger than it should be. Right. Anybody who profits out of trading as a profit, but trades out of charging fees for trading. That's where the Wolf on Wall Street was really good. The same with Matthew McConaughey explaining it to what's his name?
Leonardo DiCaprio.
Leonardo DiCaprio, yeah. And he said, look, they get, you've got to keep them in the market. So he said, once they make a bit of money, notional money on one stock, persuade them to put into another stock. And he said, they get an increase in the price of the shares they think they own. We dock them for cash every damn time. So the parasites, that side of the finance sector, that's what's grown successfully. And at the same time, we've built an economy which is incredibly fragile, as we're seeing now as climate change is striking big time. All the investments that we were undertaking, all the ostentatious purchases that were undertaken in that bubble period, all the super yachts that people, the ultra wealthy bought for themselves. When we find ourselves in a climate crisis, and that's hello southern Canada right now from that front, we can't repurpose that stuff. We can't turn one of these luxury yachts into accommodation for 10,000 people who are displaced by climate change, by heat waves in Canada. So we've got a huge amount of waste coming out of that, and it'll be obvious when the transition occurs.
So I've got it's not a good surprise. I was frustrated with this one. I approached an economist, and I can't say his name because he won't let me, because his position and this kind of thing, right? But he told me that and he knows the show, so he knows the theme of our show, which is COVID and climate change. I'd be glad to know it wasn't an attack on you, but it was. But he said, I could not, my mouth drops when I read this. He said that that basically the COVID and climate change narratives are bullshit. And Steve, this is not a guy from a trailer park, or, and no offense to the trailer park people, but this was somebody rather significant, and it was obviously off the record. But my mouth just dropped, and I thought, okay, typically I thought educated person, no direct interest in multinational conglomerates or like this kind of thing, like Warren Buffett kind of stuff. What is wrong with somebody that is seemingly educated that just says a climate change is a bullshit narrative? Like, am I missing something here?
You haven't been indoctrinated in neoclassical economics. That's what you're missing. I'll have a guess and give the guy, I'll randomly describe, and I was going to look at your facial reaction, you're looking for a file. I'm going to call him Larry. Will that do? Okay, so that's Larry, and I'm thinking of Larry Summers, obviously, here. Larry would be one who's swallowed the neoclassical narrative about climate change. And it's a weird narrative, because the way it goes is capitalism can cope with anything, therefore climate change can't be a problem. That's how they think. And I want to prove that by bringing up a survey that Nordhaus did of experts on climate change. Now, Nordhaus's experts included 8 economists whom he said in the paper itself, their area of expertise wasn't climate change. What the fuck are you doing interviewing about climate change then? Okay. And one of them was Larry Summers. Now, I'm sure Larry is responsible for the quote I'm about to find here. I'll just actually bring it up. Here we go. Let's make the screen a bit bigger. Pardon us. Where is it? Okay, this is one economist stated there would be little impact through ecosystems on the economy. Quote, for my answer, the existence value of species is irrelevant. I don't care about ants except for drugs. I don't give a stuff whether you care about them for ants. You take ants out of the ecosystem, it'd probably collapse. So there's this ignorant arrogance that economists have that really emanates from them thinking capitalism can cope with any surprise. Now, of course, COVID's come along, and that's not looking too damn good. So what do they end up doing? A large number of economists end up being COVID deniers as well as climate change deniers. I read them quite frequently. There's a fairly famous one in Australia. There's a mate of mine in the UK, John Hearn, who comes up with this garbage about it just being like the flu. I mean, for God's sake, I've been in touch with nurses in intensive care. This is not like the flu. People who die of this thing die a far more painful death than anything that comes out of the fraction that die of the flu. It's far more contagious, it's far more dangerous, and it's evolving, and we don't have any resistance to it as we do have collectively as a species to the flu to some degree. So, but they come up with this narrative because if they don't come up with that narrative, they've got to accept that there should be a government intervention to shut the market economy down and maintain spending in the meantime. Which, if you talk to epidemiologists, if we did that for a 6 to 8 week period, we'd wipe this disease off the face of the planet.
Simple, so, exactly. Simple. Yeah.
So, but they are caught up in having to deny the seriousness of challenges, because if they confront that seriousness properly, it means that the market system can't cope with what we're about to experience. Now, equally on climate change, I think I told you I'm working on a paper for the Royal Society on climate change, and we're opening the paper with the absolute abject misreading of a serious scientific paper by William Nordhaus. So there was a paper which Nordhaus said scientists did a review of potential tipping points and said they found no critical tipping elements with a time horizon of less than 300 years until global temperatures have increased by at least 3 degrees Celsius. That's a direct quote from Nordhaus. The quote from the paper was, our synthesis of current, I hate that word, of present knowledge suggests that a variety of tipping points could reach their critical point within this century under anthropogenic climate change. And the one that they pointed out most directly, we're seeing right now, happened with a 0.5 degree increase in temperature, which we've already achieved, between 0.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, is the Arctic summer sea ice. Now, he can read this paper, and the paper blatantly states there were tipping points that are triggered this century, and there of the 9 large-scale climatic systems they looked at, 7 of them they thought could be tripped this century. And he says nothing for 3 centuries until temperatures have increased by 3 degrees. You look at it and you think, if I could see him reading this, I'd be grabbing his head and smashing it against the paper saying, read the bloody words. Yeah. Don't tell me what you would like to see on the paper. Tell me what's written there. And so because it means that they have a desire to say capitalism can cope with anything, therefore nothing can be a serious challenge. These guys could be seeing a meteor coming for the planet, dinosaurs Mark II, 65 million years and all that jazz, and they'd be saying, oh, it won't do much damage. So it's just this ludicrous belief in the adaptability and flexibility of capitalism, and therefore any threat that we face can't be systemic because capitalism can cope with anything. Therefore, COVID is not a problem, and neither is climate change.
That's just so ridiculous, Steve. In one hand, you've got an economic system, right? The economic proofs that you're trying to move forward, but on the other hand, you're also coming at this with a climate change issue and COVID and. So, it's got to be overwhelming. It's not like you just have to advocate, to change minds with a neoclassical. You are fighting, the entrenchment. You're realizing this is probably what really drove you to, the passion that you actually are as a public figure, because, no matter which way I turn, I'm seeing it and I'm just starting to experience it. You must have been experiencing it for the last decade.
50 years.
Really? Yeah.
My first exposure to how economists misread climate change data was William Nordhaus's paper in 1972 or 3 on the limits to growth, or the predecessor to the limits to growth, Forrester's global, world dynamics model. And I'd read Forrester in his paper, the book, and I'd read Limits to Growth when Nordhaus's paper first came out. And having gone through this experience 40 years later, I remember that experience saying, what the fuck has this guy read? Where the hell did he find that conclusion? But I also remember going to I wish I could remember the economist involved, because there must have been a big shot economist in 1987 or thereabouts. I think it was between 87 and 90, when I was working at the University of New South Wales, we were all corralled off to the biggest theatre on the campus, capacity 3,000, to hear this famous economist talk. I've got a feeling it'll be David Pearce. This is just a guess. He died some years ago, famous English neoclassical economist. And I vividly remember him talking about climate change and saying, well, they say it's going to be a couple of degrees warmer. I'll wear one less cardigan during summer. I mean, meaning the UK, of course. I thought, you moron.
This is ridiculous.
Yeah, it's just, I've had 50 years of it.
Yeah, this is ridiculous. There's somebody that carries, fairly big bat in terms of like a public intellectual, this Jordan Peterson. He's somebody that, right? So he's kind of on a Christian apologetic, clean your room kind of thing. I got a lot of respect for him. He's got courage, but he seems to side with the climate change as an overreaction. It's kind of a manifestation of the left. He had somebody on.
He's Canadian, isn't he?
Yeah, Edmonton. We used to say we flushed twice to get to Edmonton.
Oh, Edmonton. So I don't actually know where that is in Canada. I was going to take a look and find out. I'm just wondering how. I wonder because if he's, I wonder if he's enjoying these current 25 degrees above normal levels of temperature right now. Alberta, yeah. Maybe his experience. Oh, no, he's a bit too far north, isn't he?
Yeah. I was born and raised in Calgary, so we had that nice rivalry of the hockey teams, right? So
it is 32 degrees there right now, and it's 37 degrees at 5 o'clock. So I think he's getting a certain 38 tomorrow. So hopefully some of these guys. I mean, the thing is, you can believe there's no iceberg until after the Titanic starts to sink. And in some ways, there might be this Canadian heat wave that's the Titanic issue for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, it was that, but it was also this. The one thing that I wanted to talk to you about was this Bjorn Lomborg.
That's Weasel. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm trying to, there's part of I guess a theory or a position. That's almost what it is. It's like a position that he's saying we should spend more money on. We could be more effective with spending money in other areas, right? I'm wondering if this sounds a lot like that argument about the Olympics, right? We shouldn't spend, millions and $1 billion on Olympics because we should be spending it on social housing and this and this and this and this. And look, the problem that it puts you into is that it's not that we're if the Olympics came to a city, right, we would spend $1 billion. The economic benefit would be what it would be: infrastructure, roads, athletic facilities, so on and so forth. If the Olympics didn't come, there's no money being spent at all, right? So I just. It's one of these things that it's like it kind of traps you, because of course I would like to see the world spend more money, like $1 trillion, and start to alleviate drinking water across the world and proper sanitation and all of these kinds of things, right? Part of me kind of shakes my head and say, why can't we do that?
Yeah.
Right.
He's a denialist, or rather trivializer, and he relies upon the economists all the way through. He cherry picks the scientific data to find holes in any particular paper and doesn't at all look behind the absolutely ludicrous melange of garbage in the neoclassical papers. I mean, if he applied the same critical eye to economists that he does to scientists, then why isn't he saying, well, it's obviously crazy for Nordhaus to think that 87% of industry will be unaffected because it happens indoors?
Yeah.
Anybody with any critical faculty say, well, that's obviously a crazy assumption. Let's criticize that. No, he takes it as gold standard. That's totally, I mean, the guys, when I look at the behavior of some of these people, I mean, Richard Toll just seems to be a classic ideologue. I've got my own little theories about his psychology, but he seems to believe what he's talking about, as absurd as it is. Lomborg, I read it and I think you must be getting this must be a nice little earner for you. Most of the time when people tell me somebody is bought off by vested interest to have the views they have, I'll say no, they believe it for free, and they get the benefit out of it because somebody will subsidize them because they've got the beliefs to begin with that group wants them to have. But somebody like Lomborg, I look at it and I think, fucking oath. This is so transparently bad. You're avidly picking apart the science papers to find any little niche that you can undermine the argument with, and you don't even look at the blatantly obvious nonsense that the economists are writing. So I'm very, I have no respect for any of these people, but at least I believe that Nordhaus and Toll and Mendelssohn and the others in the economics believe their own bullshit. I just wonder whether Lomborg finds bullshit as a profitable industry to be in.
Well, I think, let's think about it this way. And I operate a small little publishing entity, mostly digital, and a media outlet. I do work with academics. I work with thought leaders. Now, my whole point on this is that there's an obvious growing trend for academics to get more of a public representation, to sell their books, to build their profiles, to build their brands. And so let's take Lomborg for an instance. He puts something out that might be controversial and, like you said, speaks to a particular kind of audience. If it sounds scientific, oh shit, he's got the credentials. So
no, he hasn't, of course. He's a PhD in political science.
Right.
Let's just get that right. The guy doesn't even have an economics degree, and he certainly doesn't have a science degree. So he's in no position to be, a political scientist. You don't have the credentials to critically assess science papers. Okay, you have to accept them unless there's a blatantly obvious mathematical error that you have the capacity to point out. So he doesn't have the credentials. He has a PhD. It's not in basket weaving, but in terms of climate science, it might as well be.
So what would be, well, before I get on to the point about what the effectiveness of a political science degree would be used for, I do know that I was listening to this interview. He actually has a group of people that are trying to work with countries here. Like, this is how much of a franchise that he's building, right? So it's
the Copenhagen Institute,
right. And so this seems scary to me. So then back to my point about the political science degree. I would say a coupled degree with an economics degree might be a really good, starting point, but he doesn't have that. So is it more like a political science degree would give you the ability to be a commentary on the political, comings and goings of our society? But that's
that's more the sort of stuff that Nate Silver might. You might find yourself sitting next to Nate Silver talking about the next electoral outcome. It's not the sort of thing which you should be involved in deciding whether climate change is happening or not, or whether climate change is serious or not. This is one of the areas where I'm, as much as I regard economists as not experts, they're not experts on the economy, they're experts on a false model of the economy. But most other disciplines are experts in their own area, and I have immense deference to them. For example, if they tell me COVID's dangerous, I accept COVID is dangerous, and they've told me precisely that. If I read an epidemiologist telling me how to suppress it, that's the way you do it, not the way the economists advise, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, he's pulled in people who are of like mind, and they're being funded by, I don't know who the actual funding is for the Copenhagen Institute. I have looked at it occasionally. I think there's a fairly large number of oil and coal interests in there. So this is part of the blizzard of alternative ideas that comes out when either you get a major element of society being criticized, like, for example, cigarette smoking. You can find somebody somewhere who's going to argue that cigarettes are good for you with a PhD, appropriate PhD to it. There's always going to be somebody on the spectrum, and you find them and fund them. And he's pulled them together for climate change into the Copenhagen Institute.
Wow, that's scary. Scary, Steve. Really is scary.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I think this kind of series and the work that you're doing, especially what you're doing with the paper that you're going to release, is just it's absolutely. I mean, you could say it's a godsend. It just is. It's going to be hopefully it's going to kind of usher in the change that we need.
Yeah, well, my feeling is it won't. I'm hoping I can get the scientists to be what my ambition is to get the scientists realizing how bad economics is and how much economics has undermined their work on climate change, and get them attacking the economists directly. That would be some chance to give a warning before we hit a serious crisis. But again, looking at the madness in Canada right now, the climate madness up there, we're likely to see drastic impacts on the climate coming through this decade. And as they start coming through, then we're going to say, well, who dissuaded us not to worry about this? Now, the first thing people are going to look for are the obvious vested interests, the Koch brothers, the oil and gas companies, and so on. And they've done a large amount to promote delay and denialism on climate. But the economists have fueled it by providing the foundation for analysing it and saying it's no big deal. And they may well manage to escape attention during this whole damn thing. I'm trying to make sure they don't escape attention. I want to point this out and saying how bad their work is. But I think, we're only going to get people like myself having some impact on actual policy after we're in a serious, after it's obvious we're in a serious climate crisis and we have to radically change the direction of society. Then they might listen to people like me, but even then, there's no guarantee of that.
Well, and we have to, you'd think it's obvious because that kind of definition it should not be open to subjectivity. To me, it's obvious. To you, it's obvious. It's just, we got to get the herd to make sure that it's obvious. So one last question before we kind of wrap up. I think that's, pretty close to this today's event. There is a dialogue in our society that we should take from the wealthiest, like strip some of their wealth down. I don't agree with that at all. I don't think that's becoming of a society where people have actually earned income or money and resources. I don't think that's. But in the previous example that you just gave with the Koch brothers, and I mean in particular with economists that hold almost like a liable position in these types of situations, there feels like a last kind of grab at what's remaining while you can get it. It's a looting of sorts. It feels like a looting, right? We're in a state of emergency, and the looting that's taking place is from the people that have access to the goods and the money and that's what it feels like to me. Do you see any kind of resemblance there?
In a sense, I do. I mean, I'm certainly the oil and gas interests that have funded misinformation on climate change. They have every reason to have their wealth stripped from them completely. And I think we're going to have to do things like that if people won't take the change in direction seriously. We need some sacrifices. Okay, if you're going to say seriously change direction, you have to see people who are in incredible wealth now being pushed at the opposite extreme as a direct consequence of what they've done. Otherwise, if you try to enforce a future society to try to curb our damage to the climate and go in the opposite direction, I don't think that the mass of people will have that trust we showed at the beginning of the segment unless they see the people who led to the situation we're in now are punished for it.
So how would you see that this could move into like a judicial framework, right? I mean,
Well, that's happening. There's actually a group of lawyers who are developing a law they call Ecocide. And so, we've had genocide. This is Ecocide, and I think that should be enabled as a law, and it has to be retrospective. Okay, because if you only do it after this is a bit like genocide. The laws about genocide, I think, were developed after the Nazis killed 6 million Jews. You don't want to say, we're sorry, terribly sorry. You didn't know it was illegal beforehand, so we can't prosecute if you're. No, sorry, you should have had the ethics to understand it was illegal when you did it. We're now putting a law that means we can, in the case of the genocide, over the Nazis, we can hang you at Nuremberg for the crimes you've committed against humanity. Well, these are crimes against the ecosphere.
Yeah.
So that is happening, and I'm supporting those objectives. And I want to make sure it's not just the oil executives who end up there.
Here, here. I'm going to do some more research on that. And as always, Steve, you're such a wealth of information. I'm going to be doing more digging and posting some articles and stuff. But thanks again. You're just
don't go too quickly, because I want to share something too.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and that's this. Just recently, my cartoon book has been it's being published. I've got 2 cartoon books that I've written. One called Econ Comics, and that's being syndicated by Arcaven Comics starting this week. So if you go to Arcaven Comics, you can find it by going to my Patreon site. I've linked straight from Patreon, but Arcaven Econ Comics, and that's what you'll see when you go to and you click on here, and you see the first syndication of my little satire on economics.
Is that you, Steve, there in that little?
Yeah, that's a caricature of me. Yeah.
Right on. Okay, I like that.
Yeah. So I had a bit of fun writing this stuff. There's three satires. This is the first one on on Ricardo, and the next one is coming out in a week's time. I believe every week I'll put out 4 frames of the cartoon.
Oh, that's wonderful, and that's on your Patreon account, right?
I've linked to it from my Patreon account. This is actually like another website called Arcaven. But if I go to my Patreon site at the moment, that's the most recent post. Let's bring up Patreon here.
I got to get in your Patreon too.
Please.
Yeah, I got to do that.
Okay, so that's when I've got the link. Waiting for it to come. Okay, and that's what you'll see. And then click here, you get to Arcaven. And then there's a little blurb about me, and then you click on the truth about economics, and you get the first cartoon.
Oh, that's brilliant. I'm going to spend some time on that, and hopefully I'll have a chuckle or two, hey?
Yep, hope so. Okay, and I'll try to be on time next time, Daniel. Okay.
Oh, no problem. Don't sweat it. You're awesome, Steve.
Okay.
We'll talk to you later.
Okay, bye.
Right.